The dusty photograph arrived at the Montana Historical Society in a cracked leather satchel, donated by the estate of Eleanor Whitman, whose great-grandfather had been a cattle rancher in the 1870s. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Society's lead archivist, carefully lifted the sepia-toned image from its protective sleeve, expecting another routine addition to their Western collection. The photograph showed 7 cowboys posed in front of a weathered barn, their faces hardened by sun and wind. Each man stood with the casual confidence of those who lived by rope and rifle, their wide-brimmed hats casting shadows across weathered features. The backdrop revealed the harsh beauty of the Montana Territory in 1878, endless grasslands stretching toward distant mountains, where cattle dotting the landscape like scattered seeds. Sarah squinted at the faded ink on the photograph's reverse. Whitman Ranch Hands, summer 1878. She was about to file it away when something caught her eye. Using her magnifying glass, she leaned closer to examine the details. The cowboys' clothing told stories of hard work, leather chaps scarred by thorns, shirts patched and repatched, gun belts worn smooth by constant use. But as her gaze moved systematically across the image, she paused at the boots of the man standing second from the right. Unlike the others wearing typical cowboy boots, his footwear seemed different somehow. The leather appeared unusually fine, almost elegant, and there was something about the stitching pattern that didn't quite fit with the rough frontier setting. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she adjusted the focus of her magnifying glass. After 20 years of cataloging Western artifacts, she had developed an instinct for details that didn't belong. These boots were telling her a story, one that might challenge everything historians thought they knew about this particular photograph and the men in it. Dr. Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as she positioned the high-resolution scanner over the photograph. The digital enhancement would reveal details invisible to the naked eye, details that had remained hidden for nearly 150 years. As the image appeared on her computer screen in stunning clarity, her breath caught in her throat. The man's boots weren't just unusually fine, they were impossible. The leather showed a distinctive cross-hatched pattern that she recognized immediately from her studies of 19th-century footwear. These were dress boots, the kind worn by wealthy gentlemen in New York or Boston, not by cattle hands on a remote Montana ranch. More disturbing still, she could now make out small metal rivets along the sole, a manufacturing technique that wouldn't be invented for another decade. This can't be right, Sarah whispered to herself, adjusting the image contrast. But there it was, clear as daylight, technology that shouldn't exist in 1878. Worn by a man whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face marked him unmistakably as a working cowboy. She pulled out her reference books, cross-checking manufacturing techniques and bootmaking history. The riveted sole construction didn't appear in American footwear until the late 1880s, and even then, only in high-end urban factories. No frontier bootmaker would have had access to such techniques, let alone the specialized tools required. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be a hoax? A doctored photograph created decades later, but the image showed all the signs of authentic period photography. The chemical staining, the paper composition, even the way light fell across the subjects matched perfectly with 1870s photographic techniques. She picked up her phone to call Professor James Hartford at the University of Montana, her mentor and the foremost expert on Western American history. If anyone could help her make sense of this anomaly, it would be him. But as she dialed, a chilling thought occurred to her. What if this photograph was authentic, and the man in those impossible boots wasn't who he appeared to be? Professor Hartford arrived at the Montana Historical Society within the hour, his silver beard betraying his excitement despite his attempts to appear scholarly and composed. At 72, he had spent 5 decades studying the American West, and Sarah's urgent phone call had piqued his curiosity in a way nothing had for years. "Show me," he said simply, settling his wire-rimmed glasses on his nose. Sarah pulled up the enhanced digital image on her computer screen. Hartford leaned forward, studying the photograph with the intensity of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. His eyes moved methodically across each face, each piece of clothing, each detail of the setting. "The Whitman Ranch," he murmured, recognizing the location. "I've studied this property before." Jonathan Whitman ran cattle there from 1876 to 1882. Solid operation, employed about a dozen men during peak season. He paused, pointing at the man with the mysterious boots. "But I don't recognize this fellow." Sarah opened her research folder. I've been digging through the Whitman family records all morning. 6 of these 7 men are documented. Payroll records, letters home, even a few newspaper mentions. But this man, she pointed to the figure in question, doesn't appear in any of the ranch documentation. Hartford's expression grew thoughtful. That's unusual. Ranch owners kept meticulous records, especially of their permanent hands. Every cowboy was an investment. Room, board, wages. They didn't employ mystery men. Together they began examining every detail of the unknown cowboy's appearance. He stood slightly apart from the others, his posture suggesting confidence rather than the easy camaraderie shared by the rest of the group. His clothing, while appearing appropriately worn, showed subtle differences upon closer inspection. The fabric of his shirt was of higher quality. His gun belt showed less wear than those of his companions. "There's something else," Sarah said, adjusting the image zoom. "Look at his hands." The man's left hand rested casually on his hip, but his right hand was positioned oddly, partially concealed behind the cowboy next to him. It's almost like he's hiding something. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the archives before dawn, determined to solve the mystery of the unnamed cowboy. She had spent the night researching everything she could find about the Whitman Ranch, and several disturbing patterns had emerged. The ranch's most profitable year had been 1878, the same year the photograph was taken. Yet the financial records showed unexplained gaps and irregularities. Professor Hartford joined her at 8 o'clock, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a folder thick with documents. "I've been in touch with colleagues at several universities," he announced. "The boot technology you've identified definitely didn't exist in 1878. But there's something else. I found a mention of the Whitman Ranch in some old territorial law enforcement records." Sarah looked up from her computer screen. Law enforcement? 3 cattle rustling incidents in the summer of 1878, all involving ranches within 50 miles of Whitman's property. The interesting thing is, Whitman's herd was never touched, despite being the largest and most valuable in the area. The territorial marshal noted it as peculiar in his report. They spread out maps of the region, marking the locations of the rustling incidents. A clear pattern emerged. The stolen cattle had all been moved along routes that would have taken them directly past Whitman Ranch land. For rustlers to avoid such a prime target while hitting smaller, less profitable operations suggested either incredible restraint or inside information. Sarah pulled up the enhanced photograph again, this time focusing on the background details. The barn behind the Cowboys showed signs of recent construction, fresh lumber mixed with weathered boards, as if it had been recently expanded or modified. More intriguingly, she could make out wagon tracks in the dirt that seemed unusually deep, suggesting heavy loads had been moved recently. "Professor," she said slowly, "what if this man wasn't a cowboy at all? What if he was something else entirely? Someone who needed to blend in, to watch and wait?" Hartford set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "A Pinkerton detective," he breathed. "The timing would be perfect. The agency was actively investigating cattle rustling throughout Montana Territory in the late 1870s. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard as she accessed the National Archives digital database. Pinkerton Detective Agency records from the 1870s were notoriously incomplete. The agency had destroyed many files to protect their methods and clients, but some territorial cooperation records had survived. "Here," she said, pointing at her screen. "A requisition for undercover operative deployment, Montana Territory, cattle theft investigation, summer 1878. No names, but the dates match perfectly." Hartford leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. The Pinkertons were famous for their attention to detail, their ability to blend into any environment. But they were also Eastern gentlemen, used to fine things. An operative might successfully disguise his manner and speech, but small details, like expensive boots, might slip through. They spent the morning researching Pinkerton methods and known operatives from the period. The agency recruited educated men, often former military officers or law enforcement, who could adapt to various roles. Their training was extensive, but their backgrounds often betrayed them in subtle ways. Sarah made a breakthrough when she found a shipping manifest from a Chicago bootmaker to the Pinkerton Chicago office, dated May 1878. The order included 12 pairs finest dress boots, modified for field work, exactly the type of footwear that might explain the anachronistic riveted soles they'd discovered. "Modified for field work," Hartford repeated thoughtfully. That would explain the advanced construction techniques. The Pinkertons had access to the latest manufacturing innovations, things that wouldn't reach general market for years. But the most chilling discovery came when Sarah cross-referenced the cattle rustling incidents with known Pinkerton case files. She found a brief mention in an archived report. Operation Montana concluded successfully, September 1878. Inside man neutralized. Stolen cattle recovered. Case closed with extreme prejudice. Extreme prejudice, Sarah whispered. In Pinkerton terminology, that meant only one thing. Someone had been killed. Hartford stared at the photograph with new eyes. The man in the expensive boots wasn't just a detective. He was a detective who had likely died for his work, his true identity hidden for nearly 150 years among the faces of the men he'd been investigating. The revelation that their mysterious cowboy was likely a murdered Pinkerton operative sent Sarah and Professor Hartford down a darker path of investigation. They began examining territorial death records and newspaper archives from late summer 1878, searching for any mention of unexplained deaths or disappearances around the Whitman Ranch. Sarah found it buried in the September 15, 1878 edition of the Billings County Herald. Local ranch hand found deceased in creek bed, apparent drowning. Body badly decomposed due to summer heat. No identification found. Burial in county cemetery. The timing was perfect, just weeks after the photograph was taken. Just as the Pinkerton case file noted, operation concluded. But drowning seemed an unlikely fate for an experienced operative, unless it hadn't been accidental. Hartford had been studying the faces in the photograph more carefully, particularly their expressions and body language. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the group dynamics. "These 6 authentic ranch hands are clearly comfortable together. Notice how they're positioned, the casual way they relate to each other. But our mystery man is isolated. And look at the faces of the others." Sarah examined the image more closely. Now that Hartford had pointed it out, she could see the subtle tension. The cowboy standing directly next to the Pinkerton operative had his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes not looking at the camera but sideways, toward the detective. Another man in the back row had his hand resting very close to his gun belt, a position that suggested alertness rather than relaxation. "They knew," she breathed. "Somehow, they'd figured out who he was." Hartford nodded grimly. "The question is how much they knew, and when they knew it. Was this photograph taken before or after they discovered his true identity?" They turned their attention to the ranch records again, this time looking for anything that might explain how a Pinkerton detective's cover had been blown. Sarah discovered that Jonathan Whitman had a brother, Marcus, who had worked as a clerk for the Territorial Marshal's office. Exactly the kind of position that might have access to information about ongoing investigations. More disturbing still, Marcus Whitman had left his government job abruptly in August 1878, just before the mysterious drowning. His departure memo cited personal reasons, but the timing suggested something more sinister. This wasn't just cattle rustling, Sarah realized. This was a conspiracy that reached into law enforcement itself. Professor Hartford spent the evening reaching out to his network of historian colleagues, while Sarah dove deeper into territorial records. What they discovered painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond simple cattle theft. Marcus Whitman hadn't just been a clerk. He had been specifically responsible for coordinating information between territorial marshals and outside law enforcement agencies, including the Pinkertons. He would have known about the undercover operation from the very beginning, would have known the detective's real identity and mission. Sarah found the smoking gun in a collection of personal letters donated to the University of Montana archives decades earlier. A letter from Marcus to Jonathan Whitman, dated July 20th, 1878, contained the chilling line, "The Eastern gentleman asking questions about our business arrangements is not who he claims to be. We must handle this matter carefully and permanently." This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment discovery, Hartford observed. They had weeks to plan what they were going to do. That photograph might have been taken as a kind of trophy, the last image of a man they intended to murder. The conspiracy appeared to involve not just the Whitman brothers, but several of the ranch hands and possibly other ranchers in the area. The cattle rustling hadn't been random crimes. It had been an organized operation, with inside information allowing them to avoid law enforcement and target specific herds. Sarah discovered financial records showing that the Whitman Ranch had purchased an unusual amount of cattle in late 1878, paying cash and asking no questions about the animals' origins. The brothers had been operating a cattle laundering operation, taking stolen livestock, rebranding them, and selling them to Eastern markets. The Pinkerton detective had gotten too close to the truth. His expensive boots, his careful positioning in the photograph, his hidden right hand, all suggested a man who knew he was in danger but was determined to gather evidence. Sarah wondered what he might have been concealing in that partially hidden hand. A photograph of his own? A piece of evidence? A message? Hartford stared at the image with new understanding. 7 men posed for this photograph, he said quietly, but only 6 of them expected to be alive by the end of the summer. The breakthrough came when Sarah decided to examine not just what was visible in the photograph, but what might be hidden. Using advanced digital enhancement techniques, she began analyzing shadows and reflections, searching for any clue about what the Pinkerton detective might have been concealing in his partially hidden right hand. There, barely visible in the shadow cast by his body, she found it, the edge of what appeared to be a small notebook or folded papers. The detective hadn't just been posing for a photograph. He had been documenting evidence, even in the presence of the men who suspected his true identity. Professor Hartford contacted a digital forensics expert at the State University, who was able to enhance the shadow detail even further. The object in the detective's hand was definitely paper, and there appeared to be writing or sketches visible on the exposed edge. He was gathering evidence right up until the end, Sarah realized. Even knowing he was in danger, he continued his investigation. Their research into Pinkerton methods revealed that operatives were trained to maintain detailed journals of their investigations, including sketches of brands, descriptions of suspicious activities, and records of conversations. If the detective in the photograph had been following standard procedure, that hidden notebook would have contained damning evidence about the entire cattle rustling operation. Sarah found a mention in territorial court records of a notebook recovered from the creek where the unidentified body had been found. The local sheriff had noted it as water-damaged papers, illegible, and had disposed of them. But the timing and location suggested they had found the detective's evidence and destroyed it, either through incompetence or complicity. Further investigation revealed that Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had handled the drowning case, had received several large cash payments from unknown sources in the months following the incident. His bank records, preserved in county archives, showed deposits that far exceeded his official salary. The corruption went all the way to the top, Hartford observed. They had the sheriff, the territorial marshal's clerk, and probably others. This detective never had a chance, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up on finding justice for the unnamed operative. "His notebook may be gone," she said, "but he left us one final clue. This photograph, and I think there's more to discover." Sarah's obsession with the mysterious photograph had consumed her for weeks, but she was convinced that one crucial piece of evidence remained hidden in plain sight. She had enlarged every detail, analyzed every shadow, examined every face, but something kept nagging at her about the detective's positioning and expression. Working late one evening, she decided to examine the photograph from a completely different angle. Instead of focusing on what the detective might have been hiding, she began looking at what he might have been revealing. His stance, his expression, even the angle of his hat. Everything seemed carefully calculated. Then she saw it. The detective's left hand, resting casually on his hip, wasn't positioned randomly. His fingers were arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, thumb and index finger forming a circle, middle finger extended, ring finger bent. It looked natural enough to avoid suspicion, but Sarah recognized it as a hand signal. Professor Hartford was skeptical when she called him that evening. Hand signals? That seems like a stretch, Sarah. But Sarah had done her research. The Pinkertons used coded communications extensively. Operatives working undercover needed ways to pass information without arousing suspicion. I found references to hand signals in their training materials. The next day, they consulted with Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a specialist in 19th century communication codes at the University of Chicago. She examined the enhanced photograph and confirmed Sarah's suspicions. "This is definitely a coded message," Dr. Warren explained over video call. The Pinkerton agency adapted several military signal systems for civilian use. This particular configuration indicates danger identified, assistance required, evidence secured. The detective had been trying to communicate with whoever might eventually see the photograph. He knew he was in mortal danger, but he had also secured evidence of the conspiracy. The question was, where? Sarah returned to the original photograph with fresh eyes, this time looking for any other coded elements. She found them in the detective's boot placement, his feet positioned at specific angles that, according to Dr. Warren's analysis, indicated direction and distance. The detective had been pointing towards something, giving precise directions to evidence he had hidden. Following the angles indicated by his feet, Sarah plotted coordinates on a modern map of the former Whitman Ranch property. "He buried it," she told Hartford excitedly. "Somewhere on that ranch, there's still evidence of what really happened in 1878. The coordinates led to a section of the former Whitman Ranch that was now part of Glacier National Park. Sarah and Professor Hartford obtained the necessary permits for an archaeological investigation, citing the historical significance of their discovery. The Park Service, intrigued by the story of the murdered Pinkerton detective, agreed to support their search. Using ground-penetrating radar, the team located an anomaly in the soil at the precise coordinates indicated by the detective's coded stance. 12 inches down, wrapped in oiled leather and preserved by Montana's dry climate, they found Detective William Morrison's evidence cache. The package contained Morrison's complete investigation notes, detailed sketches of altered cattle brands, financial records copied from the Whitman Ranch office, and most damning of all, a photograph of Marcus Whitman meeting with known cattle thieves. Morrison had not only identified the conspiracy, but had documented it thoroughly. More poignantly, the cache contained Morrison's personal effects, letters from his wife in Chicago, a photograph of his 2 young daughters, and his final report to the Pinkerton agency, dated the day before his murder. In careful handwriting he had written, "The operation has been compromised. I have secured evidence that will convict all parties involved. If something should happen to me, I have left instructions for recovery of this material. Justice must be served." Sarah contacted Morrison's living descendants, who had never known the truth about their ancestors' fate. Family records showed that William Morrison had supposedly died of pneumonia while working as a traveling salesman, a cover story created by the Pinkerton agency to protect his family from retribution. The discovery made national news, finally giving Detective William Morrison the recognition he deserved. The Montana Historical Society created a permanent exhibit about his sacrifice, and the National Park Service installed a memorial marker at the location where his evidence was recovered. Professor Hartford summed up the significance of their discovery in his final report. A single photograph, overlooked for nearly 150 years, has revealed not just a forgotten crime, but a forgotten hero. Detective Morrison's boots told us a story of corruption and conspiracy, but more importantly, they told us a story of courage and dedication to justice that transcended even death itself. The photograph now hangs in a place of honor in the Montana Historical Society, with a detailed placard explaining Morrison's true identity and sacrifice. Visitors often comment on the detective's expression, how, even surrounded by his enemies and facing certain death, his eyes still held the steady gaze of a man committed to justice. Sarah kept a copy of the photograph on her desk, a reminder that history's greatest stories often hide in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to look closer and brave enough to uncover the truth.